The historian who first examined the case in 1964 wrote in his notes that Helen Carveth's silence was not the silence of confusion or trauma, but of decision. He underlined the word twice. Helen returned to Duluth on the morning of November 19, 1903, aboard the lumber steamer Naomi Wells, 23 days after she had departed on what the Duluth Herald had called a promising geological expedition to the North Shore Islands. She was 26 years old. She was alone. She would speak of those 23 days only once, in the most minimal terms required by law, and then never again. The others did not return. Thomas Carveth, her husband of 4 years, a mining engineer with the Mesabi Range Surveys. Margaret Lindholm, Helen's cousin, a photographer who had documented iron mines across northern Minnesota. Dr. Jonas Peterson, the expedition's sponsor, a geologist from the University of Minnesota. And Samuel Oakes, their guide, a half-Ojibwe trapper who knew the islands better than any white man living. 4 people went into the islands with Helen Carveth in late October 1903. None came back. The ship's captain, Werner Halverson, testified before the county coroner that Mrs. Carveth boarded at Isle Royale's Washington Harbor with a single canvas pack. She paid her passage with cash. She did not ask about meals or accommodations. When he inquired whether she was traveling alone, she said yes. When he asked if she needed assistance, she said no. When he asked if she was well, she looked at him with what he later described as the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body. She did not speak again for the duration of the voyage. At the Duluth docks, 2 men from the county sheriff's office were waiting. The Naomi Wells had sent word ahead by wireless. A woman, alone, from the islands. The expedition that had gone missing. Helen walked down the gangway without assistance. She wore men's wool trousers and a torn mackinaw. Her hands were bandaged with strips of what appeared to be a flannel shirt. Her hair had been cut short, unevenly as if with a knife. One of the deputies later testified that she carried herself like someone moving through a place she no longer recognized. They took her to the county building. They sat her in a room with a coal stove and a single window facing the gray expanse of Lake Superior. They brought her coffee and bread. They asked her to tell them what had happened. And Helen Carveth, who had been raised to be forthcoming and truthful, who had been described by her pastor as a young woman of exceptional clarity and moral directness, refused. Not in anger, not in tears, simply refused. The deputy who conducted the initial interview, a man named Orrin Finch, who would later become sheriff, recorded her words exactly as she gave them. The document still exists in the Carleton County Archives, though it has been removed from public access since 1971. A transcript was published in a university journal in 1989, and it is from this transcript that we know what Helen said. We left Duluth on October 27th, aboard the fishing vessel Kestrel. We reached the outer islands on October 29th. We established camp on an unnamed island approximately 4 miles northeast of Isle Royale. On November 16th, I left the island alone. I cannot speak to the fate of the others. I was not present when they died. That was all. Deputy Finch pressed her. Where exactly was the island? What were the circumstances that led to her departure? Why did she leave alone? Were the others alive when she left? To each question, Helen gave the same answer. I cannot speak to that. Not, I don't know. Not, I don't remember. I cannot speak to that. It was a formulation that suggested knowledge, withheld. The coroner, Dr. Simon Thorne, examined her the following day. His report noted multiple abrasions on her hands and forearms, frostbite on 3 fingers of her left hand, evidence of significant weight loss, and what he termed a psychological affect inconsistent with acute distress, but consistent with sustained vigilance. He also noted that she refused to remove her shirt for the examination, and that when he attempted to insist, she stood and walked to the door. She did not leave. She simply stood there, her hand on the knob, until he agreed to continue the examination without further requests. In his private notes, discovered in his estate in 1952, Dr. Thorne wrote, Mrs. Carveth is concealing something, but I do not believe it is guilt. I believe it is grief. The search parties went out within 48 hours. 3 boats, 40 men, supplied for 2 weeks. They scoured the outer islands, the channels, the rocky shorelines where a camp might have been made. They found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no sign of the expedition except for a single item, a leather journal, waterlogged and illegible, wedged between rocks on a small, unnamed island that matched Helen's description. The journal was Thomas Carveth's. It had been his habit to record daily observations, but the water had taken the words. They brought it to Helen, asked if she could identify it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, yes. They asked if there was anything in the journal that might help locate the others. She said no. They asked how the journal came to be in the water. She said, I cannot speak to that. The search was called off after 12 days. Winter was closing in. The lake was becoming impassable. The men returned to Duluth with nothing. Helen Carveth was released from custody, though she had never been formally charged, on December 3, 1903. She returned to the small house on 4th Street that she had shared with Thomas. She did not attend the memorial service held at First Presbyterian. She did not respond to letters of condolence. She did not grant interviews to the newspapers, which had taken to calling the case the mystery of the Silent Islands. She lived in that house alone for the next 41 years. The few people who encountered her in those years, shopkeepers, neighbors, the postman, described a woman who was unfailingly polite, quiet, and utterly unreachable. She kept a garden. She took in sewing work. She attended no social gatherings. She made no friends. In 1911, a journalist from the Minneapolis Tribune traveled to Duluth to attempt an interview. Helen met him at the door, listened to his request and said, I have nothing to add to what I told the county in 1903. She closed the door before he could respond. In 1927, a graduate student writing a thesis on Great Lakes tragedies wrote to her, asking if she would be willing to share her recollections. She did not reply. In 1944, as she lay dying of pneumonia in St. Luke's Hospital, a nurse asked if there was anyone she wished to contact, any family, any unfinished business. Helen, lucid until the end, said no. The nurse, a young woman named Edith Larson, later told a researcher that Helen's last words were not addressed to her, but seemed to be spoken to someone not present. I kept my word. She died on January 8, 1944. She was 67 years old. She left no will, no letters, no diary. Her estate consisted of the house, a small savings account, and 3 boxes of sewing supplies. The house was sold to settle debts. The belongings were distributed to charity. Among them was a single photograph found in a drawer in the bedroom. It showed 4 people standing before a canvas tent, the dark water of Lake Superior behind them. Thomas Carveth, tall and serious, his arm around Helen's shoulders. Margaret Lindholm, smiling, holding her camera. Dr. Peterson, older, his hand raised as if in mid-sentence. And Samuel Oakes, standing slightly apart, his expression unreadable. On the back, in Helen's handwriting, October 28, 1903, the day before they reached the island. To understand what Helen Carveth refused to say, one must first understand what she had been before the silence. The records paint a picture of ordinariness that feels, in retrospect, almost cruel in its innocence. Helen Bryce was born in 1877 in Ashland, Wisconsin, the second daughter of a Lutheran minister and a school teacher. She was educated at the Ashland Normal School, where she excelled in mathematics and natural sciences, unusual subjects for a young woman of that era, but her father encouraged intellectual rigor without regard to gender. Her teachers described her as thoughtful and precise. She kept notebooks filled with sketches of local flora, measurements of rainfall, observations of bird migration patterns. She met Thomas Carveth in the spring of 1898 at a lecture on mineral deposits in the Lake Superior Basin. He was 28, newly employed by the Minnesota Mining Company, ambitious in the quiet way of engineers. She was 21, attending the lecture because she found geology beautiful. They were introduced by mutual acquaintances. Within 6 months, they were engaged. The letters between them, preserved by Helen's sister and later donated to the Minnesota Historical Society, revealed 2 people who shared a language of precision and curiosity. Thomas wrote to her about the composition of taconite, the geology of the Vermilion Range, the engineering challenges of deep shaft mining. Helen wrote back about the mathematical models she was developing to predict iron ore distribution, about the books she was reading on mineralogy, about the questions she wished she could ask if women were permitted in university geology programs. They were married in November 1899. The wedding was small. The honeymoon was a week-long trip to the North Shore, where Thomas showed her the exposed Precambrian rock formations along the Temperance River. In a letter to her sister, Helen wrote, "I have never felt so perfectly understood." They settled in Duluth. Thomas worked for the mining surveys. Helen kept house, but she also kept studying. She corresponded with geologists. She read technical journals. She built a small laboratory in the spare bedroom where she tested rock samples Thomas brought home, comparing her findings to published assays. In the mining community, she became known as Carveth's clever wife. It was meant as a compliment, though it carried the unspoken limitation: clever, but still a wife. Margaret Lindholm entered their lives in 1901. She was Helen's first cousin, 3 years younger, and unlike Helen, she had found a profession that would accept her: photography. She had apprenticed with a studio in St. Paul, then struck out on her own, documenting the industrial landscape of northern Minnesota, the mines, the lumber camps, the ore docks. Her work was technically accomplished and unafraid of harsh subject matter. She photographed miners at shift change, their faces black with dust. She photographed the widows of men killed in cave-ins. She photographed the scars the industry left on the land. Margaret visited Duluth frequently, staying with Helen and Thomas. The three of them would spend evenings discussing geology, chemistry, the ethics of resource extraction. Margaret pushed back against Thomas's faith in progress. Thomas defended the necessity of industry. Helen, as several letters suggest, occupied a middle ground, troubled by both positions. It was Margaret who first proposed the idea of an expedition. In a letter dated March 1903, she wrote to Helen, "The islands are largely unmapped. The geology is extraordinary: volcanic formations, ancient basalts, veins of copper that the old traders spoke of but never properly documented. And no one is paying attention because there's no money in it, no ore worth extracting. But that means it's still wild, still whole. I want to photograph it, and I want you to see it." Helen was intrigued. Thomas was skeptical. He had work obligations, deadlines. But Margaret persisted, and eventually she found an ally: Dr. Jonas Peterson. Peterson was a professor of geology at the University of Minnesota, nearing retirement, increasingly frustrated by the university's focus on economically viable research. He had spent years studying the Keweenawen volcanic formations of the Lake Superior Basin, and he had long wanted to conduct fieldwork on the outer islands, where erosion had exposed rock layers rarely visible elsewhere. He had funding, a small grant from a private foundation interested in pure science. He needed assistance. Margaret contacted him, proposed herself as photographer and Helen as field researcher. Peterson agreed, on one condition: they needed someone who knew the islands, who could navigate the waters and identify safe campsites. Margaret found Samuel Oakes. Oakes was 43, a man of mixed heritage who lived on the margins of both white and Ojibwe communities. He had grown up on the North Shore, the son of a French-Canadian trapper, and an Ojibwe woman from the Grand Portage Band. He knew the lake the way some men know scripture: every reef, every current, every sheltered cove. He guided fishing parties, delivered mail to remote settlements, occasionally worked for the mining companies when they needed someone to scout potential sites. He was known as reliable, quiet, a man who did not explain himself. The historical record offers little about what Oakes thought of the expedition. He left no letters, no journals. The few people who knew him said he was a man of few words under any circumstances. But he agreed to guide them. The pay was modest. The work was straightforward. And perhaps, this is speculation, there was something appealing about an expedition that had no interest in extraction, only observation. Thomas Carveth joined reluctantly. His supervisor at the mining company granted him a leave of absence, though not enthusiastically. In a letter to his brother, Thomas wrote, "Helen wants this very much, and I confess I am curious. Peterson's theories about the basalt formations are compelling, and it will be good to see the islands before winter. There is something clarifying about wilderness before it freezes." The five of them met in Duluth in mid-October. They spent a week preparing, purchasing supplies, packing equipment, reviewing maps. Margaret took photographs of the preparations, though only one survives. The image found in Helen's drawer, taken the day before they departed. The mood, according to later testimony from those who saw them off, was optimistic. They were well supplied. The weather forecast was favorable. They expected to be gone 3 weeks. On October 27, 1903, they boarded the Kestrel, a fishing vessel captained by a man named Lars Undset. Undset would later testify that the group was in good spirits, that there were no signs of tension or conflict. He remembered Margaret laughing at something Dr. Peterson said. He remembered Thomas helping Helen with her pack. He remembered Oakes standing at the rail watching the water. Undset delivered them to the outer islands on October 29th. They unloaded their supplies onto a rocky beach on an unnamed island that Oakes had selected, sheltered, with fresh water, good access to the geological formations Peterson wanted to study. Undset asked when they wanted to be picked up. Oakes said November 18th. Undset confirmed the date, shook hands with Thomas, and departed. It was the last time anyone saw the five of them together. What happened on that island in the following 18 days has never been conclusively established. But the days before, the weeks of planning, the relationships of trust and mutual respect, those are documented. They are known, and they make the silence that followed all the more unbearable, because whatever happened, it happened to people who trusted each other. The island was never officially named. On modern maps, it appears as a small, irregular landmass approximately 4 miles northeast of Isle Royale, part of the scatter of rocks and wilderness that marks the northernmost reach of American territory on Lake Superior. In 1903, it had no name because it had no value. No timber worth harvesting, no minerals worth extracting, no harbor for ships, just stone and water and wind. The search parties that went out in November 1903 identified the island based on Helen's description and the location where Thomas's journal was found. They documented it carefully, approximately 2 miles long, heavily forested with spruce and birch, a central ridge of exposed basalt running north to south, several small beaches on the eastern shore, fresh water from a creek that ran down the ridge, evidence of old campsites, fire rings, cut saplings, suggesting Oakes or others had used it before. They found the remnants of a camp on the southern beach, a fire pit, tent stakes driven into the ground, an area of flattened grass where equipment had been stored, but no tents, no supplies, no bodies, and no explanation for why the camp appeared to have been deliberately dismantled. The lead searcher, a man named Halstead, who had worked with Oakes on previous expeditions, testified that the site looked orderly, not abandoned in panic, not destroyed by storm or animal, orderly, as if someone had taken time to pack up. But Helen had arrived in Duluth with almost nothing. A single pack, minimal supplies. If the camp had been packed up, where had everything gone? Halstead noted one other detail, drag marks leading from the camp to the water's edge, as if something heavy had been pulled across the beach. When asked what he thought had been dragged, Halstead said he couldn't know for certain, but the marks were consistent with a canoe or a body. Helen never described the island. When pressed by authorities, she confirmed only that they had established camp, that the work had proceeded as planned, that there had been no immediate crisis. She would not say when things changed. She would not say what caused the separation. But there is one piece of testimony that offers a fragment of context, though it raises more questions than it answers. In December 1903, a trapper named Emile Court came forward. He had been on Isle Royale in early November, running his lines. On November 16th, the date Helen said she left the unnamed island, he had been checking traps near Washington Harbor when he saw a canoe approaching from the northeast. A woman, alone, paddling hard against the wind. He helped her beach the canoe. He offered food, shelter. She refused. She asked only how to reach the next steamer heading to Duluth. Court testified that the woman was clearly exhausted, but she was coherent. She did not appear injured beyond some cuts and bruises. When he asked if she needed help, if someone was in trouble, she said, "No, I need to leave." He asked if she was sure. She said yes. He asked where she had come from. She pointed northeast, toward the scatter of outer islands, but did not name a specific location. He asked if she was traveling alone. She hesitated, then said, "Now I am." Court gave her directions to the harbor where steamers docked. He watched her go. He later told the authorities that he had assumed she was fleeing a bad situation, a husband perhaps, or a failed prospecting venture. It wasn't his business. People came to the islands for all kinds of reasons, and they left for all kinds of reasons. He didn't think about her again until he heard about the missing expedition. When shown a photograph of Helen Carveth, he confirmed that was the woman. The authorities asked Court if he had noticed anything unusual about her demeanor, anything that suggested violence or fear or guilt. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "She looked like someone who had made a choice she'd have to live with." The canoe Court described was never found. Neither were the expedition's other watercraft. Oakes had brought 2 canoes and a small rowboat. When the search parties scoured the island and surrounding waters, they found none of them. This raised an agonizing question. If Helen had taken a canoe and the others had remained on the island, why did they not use the remaining boats to signal for help or attempt their own escape? And if the others were already dead when Helen left, why take the canoe at all? The island was isolated but not unreachable. A signal fire would have been visible from Isle Royale. Oakes would have known that. Thomas would have known that. Unless there was a reason Helen could not stay, could not wait, could not risk being found there. There is one more piece of evidence from this period, though its significance is disputed. In 1925, a fisherman named Peter Torvald was working the waters near the unnamed island when his nets snagged on something heavy. He hauled it up, a canvas pack, waterlogged and deteriorating, but still intact enough to reveal its contents. Inside, a woman's wool coat, a tin of matches, a pocket Bible with an inscription, "To Margaret, with love, Mother." Margaret Lindholm's Bible. Torvald turned it over to the authorities. They contacted Helen Carveth, asking if she could identify the items. She wrote back. A brief note, the only written communication from her in the entire case beyond her initial testimony. The note, preserved in the county archives, reads, "Yes, those belonged to my cousin. I cannot say how they came to be in the water." The authorities wrote back, asking if she had any theory, any recollection that might explain it. She did not reply. The silence around the separation, the moment when 5 became 1, is the heart of the case. Every other mystery radiates from it. Why did Helen leave alone? Were the others alive when she left? If they were dead, how did they die? If they were alive, why did she not stay? These are the questions the authorities asked in 1903. These are the questions journalists asked in the decades that followed. These are the questions historians ask now. Helen Carveth never answered them, but her silence was not random. It was structured. She would confirm facts that could be independently verified. Dates, locations, basic movements. But anything that touched on motive, on decision, on the interior experience of those 18 days, she refused. I cannot speak to that. Not I don't remember. Not I don't know. I cannot. The word implies prohibition, not from external authority, but from internal resolve, as if she had made a promise. The pressure on Helen Carveth began before she even left the county building. The families wanted answers. Thomas's brother, Edward Carveth, traveled from Chicago and demanded a full investigation. He could not accept that his brother, an experienced outdoorsman, a man who understood wilderness survival, had simply vanished without explanation. Margaret Lindholm's mother, Anna, wrote letter after letter to the Duluth authorities, to the governor, to the Department of the Interior, begging for resources to continue the search. Dr. Peterson's wife, Ingrid, was more restrained but no less insistent. She hired a private investigator, a man named Horace Dempsey, to interview Helen directly. Dempsey went to Helen's home in January 1904. She let him in. She listened to his questions. She answered only one. "I have already told the authorities everything I'm able to tell." When Dempsey pressed, suggesting that surely she owed the families more than bureaucratic evasion, Helen stood, walked to the door, and opened it. "I owe them my silence," she said. Dempsey, in his report to Mrs. Peterson, wrote, "Mrs. Carveth is not hostile, but she is immovable. I do not believe further questioning will yield results. She has made a decision, and she will not be moved from it." Samuel Oakes had no family to advocate for him, or rather, none that the white authorities recognized. His mother had died years earlier. His father had disappeared into the Northern Territories. There were cousins, members of the Grand Portage Band, but they did not engage with the investigation. Whether this was by choice or because they were not consulted is unclear. One man, however, did come forward. Louis Beaulieu, an elder from Grand Portage who had known Oakes since childhood. In the spring of 1904, Beaulieu traveled to Duluth and requested a meeting with Helen. She agreed. What was said in that meeting is unknown. Beaulieu never spoke of it publicly, but a priest at the Grand Portage mission, Father Thibault, later wrote in his personal journal that Beaulieu had returned from Duluth, troubled but satisfied that Mrs. Carveth had honored Sam. When asked what he meant by honored, Beaulieu reportedly said, "She kept what needed to be kept." The legal pressure was more direct, though ultimately futile. In February 1904, the county attorney, a man named Silas Kern, convened a grand jury to determine whether criminal charges should be brought against Helen Carveth. The charge under consideration was not murder. There was no evidence of violence, no bodies, no witnesses, but rather obstruction of justice and failure to render aid. The grand jury heard testimony from Werner Halverson, Emil Court, Deputy Finch, Dr. Thorne, and others. They reviewed the physical evidence, Thomas's journal, Margaret's Bible, the remnants of the camp. They called Helen to testify. The transcript of her testimony is brief. She confirmed the basic facts she had already given. She declined to elaborate. When asked directly if she had witnessed the deaths of the other expedition members, she said, "I was not present when they died." When asked how she could know they were dead if she was not present, she said, "I did not say I knew they were dead. I said I was not present when they died." The distinction was noted by several jurors. One of them, a shopkeeper named Arnett, later told a reporter she was parsing her words very carefully, like she knew exactly how much she could say and how much she couldn't. The grand jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned no indictment. The foreman, in his statement, said, "While Mrs. Carveth's refusal to speak fully is deeply troubling, we find no evidence of criminal conduct. Silence is not a crime." Kern was furious. He believed Helen knew what had happened and was deliberately withholding information. But without evidence of a crime, he had no recourse. In his final report, he wrote, "Mrs. Carveth is either protecting herself or protecting someone else. But the law cannot compel a person to speak when there is no proof of wrongdoing. This case will remain unresolved until she chooses to speak. I do not believe she will." He was right. The social pressure was perhaps the most relentless. Duluth in 1904 was a city of fewer than 60,000 people. Everyone knew everyone, or knew someone who did. Helen's refusal to speak became a source of intense speculation and gossip. Some believed she had killed the others, perhaps in self-defense, perhaps in madness brought on by isolation. Others believed she had fled while they were still alive, leaving them to die. Still others believed she was covering for someone else, though who that might be and why remained unclear. The rumors were vicious. Helen was called a murderer, a coward, a lunatic. Anonymous letters were left at her door. A rock was thrown through her window in the spring of 1904. The pastor of First Presbyterian, where she and Thomas had been married, visited her and gently suggested that confession might bring her peace. She thanked him for his concern and did not attend services again. Her few remaining friends, women from the church, neighbors who had known her before the expedition, tried to stand by her. But Helen did not make it easy. She did not invite sympathy. She did not explain. She simply endured. One woman, Lillian Marsh, who had been close to Helen before the tragedy, later wrote in a letter, "I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think there was some terrible reason she could not speak. But after a while, I could not bear the weight of not knowing. I stopped visiting. I'm ashamed of that now. But Helen never asked me to return. She accepted my abandonment as if she had expected it." By 1905, Helen had become a ghost in her own city. People crossed the street to avoid her. Shopkeepers served her quickly and without conversation. Children were warned to stay away from the woman in the house on 4th Street. She lived with it, quietly, without protest. In 1911, there was a brief resurgence of interest in the case. A journalist named Raymond Holt, writing for the Minneapolis Tribune, published a series of articles titled "The Silent Woman of Duluth." He reviewed the evidence, interviewed surviving witnesses, and attempted to construct a narrative that might explain Helen's silence. His conclusion: Helen had witnessed something so traumatic that her mind had suppressed the memory. He suggested that modern psychiatric treatment might help her recover what she had lost. He offered to pay for her treatment if she would agree to it. Helen declined. In a brief note, her second and final written communication to anyone outside the authorities, she wrote, "I have not lost my memory. I have lost nothing. Thank you for your concern." Holt, frustrated, wrote a follow-up article suggesting that Helen's refusal proved she was hiding something. The article was cruel. It questioned her sanity, her morality, her right to live peacefully while 4 families suffered without answers. The article prompted a response from an unexpected source. Ingrid Peterson, the widow of Dr. Jonas Peterson, wrote a letter to the Tribune. It was published on November 3rd, 1911. "I do not know what happened on that island. I do not know why Mrs. Carveth will not speak, but I know my husband. I know he would not have wanted his memory used to torment a woman who has suffered enough. Whatever Mrs. Carveth is keeping silent about, I believe she has her reasons. I ask that she be left in peace." After that, the journalists stopped coming. The final attempt to break Helen's silence came in 1932, nearly 30 years after the expedition. A psychologist from the University of Chicago, Dr. Eleanor Voss, wrote to Helen proposing a different approach. Not interrogation, not judgment, but simply an opportunity to tell her story, if she wished, in complete confidence. Dr. Voss specialized in trauma and had worked with survivors of industrial accidents and natural disasters. She understood that some experiences could not be shared publicly, but that the act of speaking them aloud, even once, might provide relief. Helen agreed to meet. Dr. Voss traveled to Duluth in August 1932. She met with Helen 3 times over the course of a week. The meetings were private. No transcripts were made. Dr. Voss gave her word that nothing Helen said would be disclosed without her permission. After the 3rd meeting, Dr. Voss returned to Chicago. She never wrote about the case. She never published her findings. In her personal papers discovered after her death in 1956, there is a single entry dated August 15, 1932. "Spoke with H.C. today. She is not traumatized. She is not repressing. She is choosing, and her choice is informed by love. I will not ask again." Helen Carveth died quietly, as she had lived the last 40 years of her life. The pneumonia came on fast. She was admitted to St. Luke's Hospital on January 5, 1944. The doctors said there was nothing to be done. She was 67, and her body had no fight left. The nurse who attended her, Edith Larson, was 23 years old and had no idea who Helen was. She knew only that the woman in bed 12 was alone, that no family came to visit, that no flowers were sent. On the evening of January 7th, Helen's breathing became labored. Edith sat with her, holding her hand, because no one should die alone. And Helen, who had been silent for so long, spoke, not to Edith, to someone Edith could not see. "I kept my word." Edith later told the researcher who interviewed her in 1967 that she asked Helen what she meant, but Helen did not answer. She died less than an hour later. There was no funeral. No obituary beyond a brief notice in the Duluth Herald. Helen Carveth, aged 67, passed away January 8th. No services planned. Her house was sold. Her belongings were dispersed. And the case, the mystery of the Silent Islands, the disappearance of 4 people, the 40-year silence of the only survivor, passed into the realm of historical curiosity. The historian who wrote the 1964 study was named Arthur Renshaw. He had come across the case while researching Great Lakes maritime disasters and had become obsessed with what he called the negative space of the archive, the places where absence of information told a story more compelling than presence. Renshaw spent 3 years tracking down every document, every interview, every scrap of evidence related to the 1903 expedition. He traveled to Duluth, to Isle Royale, to the unnamed island where the camp had been. He interviewed elderly residents who remembered Helen, who remembered the search, who remembered the gossip. His conclusion, published in the Journal of Great Lakes History, was careful and restrained. Helen Carveth's silence was not the silence of guilt or trauma, but of intentional protection. She was protecting someone or something, and she believed that speaking would betray a trust or cause harm that outweighed the harm of her silence. This suggests that whatever happened on that island, it involved a choice, and that Helen believed her silence was the most ethical option available to her. Renshaw's work prompted a brief renewal of interest. A few amateur historians made the trip to the island. A documentary filmmaker considered a project but abandoned it when it became clear there was no narrative resolution to be had. The case faded again. But Renshaw's conclusion raises the question that has haunted every serious examination of this case. What could Helen have been protecting? There are theories, none satisfying, all speculative. Perhaps she was protecting the reputation of one of the dead. Perhaps Thomas or Margaret or Peterson had done something that Helen believed should not be known. Perhaps there had been a conflict, a mistake, a moral failing that Helen believed was better buried with them. Perhaps she was protecting Samuel Oakes. Perhaps something had happened, an accident, a misunderstanding, an act that might be judged harshly by a society that already viewed him with suspicion. Perhaps Helen believed that speaking would expose him to blame he did not deserve. Perhaps she was protecting the living. Perhaps there was someone back in Duluth, a family member, a friend, someone whose life would be destroyed if the full story became known. Or perhaps she was protecting herself, not from legal consequences, but from something more personal. Perhaps she had made a choice on that island that she believed was right, but knew others would judge. Perhaps her silence was the only way to live with what she had done. Or perhaps, and this is the theory Renshaw found most compelling, she was protecting the memory of those 18 days. Perhaps whatever happened on that island was so intimate, so specific to the 5 people who were there, that to speak of it publicly would be to betray something sacred. We do not know. We cannot know. Because Helen Carveth chose silence, and silence cannot be interrogated. In 2003, on the centennial of the expedition, a small memorial was erected on Isle Royale. It lists the names of the 4 who did not return: Thomas Carveth, Margaret Lindholm, Dr. Jonas Peterson, Samuel Oakes. It does not mention Helen. The plaque reads, "In memory of those lost to the islands, November 1903. Their fate remains unknown." A park ranger who was present at the dedication later wrote, "Someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the memorial. There was no card, no name, but the flowers were fresh, as if someone had picked them that morning. I like to think it was someone who understood that silence, too, is a form of remembrance." The truth of what happened on that unnamed island in the autumn of 1903 went into the ground with Helen Carveth on January 11, 1944. She was buried in Oneota Cemetery, in a plot she had purchased years earlier. The gravestone is simple: Helen Bryce Carveth, 1877-1944. No epitaph, no inscription, just her name and the years she lived. And perhaps that is appropriate, because Helen's life, at least the last 40 years of it, was defined not by what she said, but by what she refused to say. She made a choice, on that island or in the days after. She chose silence, and she lived with that choice every day for the rest of her life. We can call it cowardice, we can call it strength, we can call it love or guilt or protection, but we cannot call it anything with certainty. Because Helen Carveth, who survived when 4 others did not, left us only one truth. Some stories are not ours to know, and some silences must be honored, even when they break our hearts.